In December of 2010, Suffolk County Police Officer John Malia, accompanied by his trusty canine partner Blue, scoured the dense underbrush off Ocean Parkway. Their mission was part of a broader search for a woman named Shannan Gilbert. She had vanished near Oak Beach, close to Gilgo Beach on Long Island. As they combed the area, Blue suddenly alerted Officer Malia to a grim discovery: a body concealed in the brush, but it was not Shannan Gilbert. Instead, the remains of another woman. This unsettling discovery led to a more thorough examination of the area, unearthing 3 additional women's bodies, all along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach.
We have, as you know, the remains of 4 persons.
These victims found in close proximity to each other and all wrapped in burlap sacks. That's significant. It sparked immediate fears of a serial killer's presence.
We don't know and will not know for weeks.
Over time, the area would reveal a total of 11 bodies.
Major break in the Gilgo Beach murders as a suspect, 59-year-old Rex Heuermann, has been arrested.
More than a decade later, finally an arrest. Then, 59-year-old Rex Heuermann, arrested and charged in the murder of 3 of those women. He remains the prime suspect in a 4th case, casting a long, dark shadow over this haunting chapter of Long Island's history.
Rex Heuermann is a demon.
I'm Dan Bowens, and this is The Tape Room. On this episode, I'm joined by my colleague, Jodi Goldberg. She has covered this case extensively over the last decade. She's been to Gilgo Beach. She's been to the neighborhood where this suspect is from, and she's been to all of the court appearances so far. So, Jodi, a lot has happened since this arrest took place, but I want to go back to all those months ago when it did happen. You've covered this case extensively. You get the call, you hear the news early in the morning. Take me through that day for you.
For so long, we thought maybe the day may never come. And so when we heard that a suspect was in custody, we hit the ground running. We wanted to be where the suspect lived. We wanted to be at the courthouse. We wanted to cover every single base possible to learn exactly what we could.
And do you remember getting your first look at Rex Heuermann? I mean, he's a gigantic man. He was walking out. That video, everyone has seen it now. What were your first impressions when you saw him?
He's someone you just don't miss. And when you do see him, many people wondered in the community, who is he? But not until he was arrested did people start talking.
And who is he? I mean, we know that he's an architect, worked in Midtown Manhattan, which is where officers did end up arresting him. What do we know about who he is?
Now he's 60, architect. His attorney would call him a family man, but many neighbors said they skipped over his house for Halloween. People were always weary of him, but he took the train just like everyone else did. He went to work in the morning. He came back for dinner. And for so many years, Dan, he lived among us.
I want to take it back a little bit to when this all started. 2010, officers are looking for Shannan Gilbert. Who was she? Why were they looking for her? And eventually it led them to the discovery of these other women.
So Shannon Gilbert was a prostitute who listed her services on Craigslist. And when she vanished, there was a massive search for her. Now, she disappeared out of Oak Beach. Oak Beach, just to let you know, a few houses were there. It was also the place where many sex parties happened. And so being that she was a prostitute, the thought is she was at some of these sex parties. And the search for Shannan led to the discovery of, now we know, the Gilgo Four, 4 other sex workers who were found, as you mentioned earlier, buried and bound in burlap sacks along a stretch of parkway in Gilgo Beach.
And Jodi, tell me and describe Gilgo Beach itself. I mean, this is an area that is kind of off the beaten path a little bit. Talk to me about, set the scene a little bit about where this is in relation to Long Island.
It's about 40 miles east of the city, south shore of Long Island, blue collar, beautiful for anyone out of town, but for those people who are familiar with Long Island and who knew about the Gilgo Beach serial killings, it was eerie.
And so they find these initial 4 bodies. and that's bad enough. They think they may have a serial killer on their hand. And then they find even more bodies and more body parts in this area. What happened?
They kept searching. And the more they searched, the more they found. Shannan Gilbert's disappearance is ultimately what sparked this massive search. And that's where it kind of all began.
And those victims, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, were all sex workers who advertised on Craigslist or other online services at that point. And they had all vanished right around the same time period. But there wasn't a lot of attention to it when they actually vanished until they were discovered years later after they had disappeared.
Shannan Gilbert's disappearance is what sparked this search. And once these 4 women were found, they kept searching. They were among the first to be found. And Melissa Bartholomew's family spoke to police saying that they've received many taunting calls from someone who was pinpointed to where Heuermann lived and worked. And that kind of continued the search. And also, they became known as the Gilgo Four, and he is now a suspect in the killing of at least 3 of them. He's the prime suspect in the 4th.
And as they move forward in the early stages of this investigation, they have this huge discovery. 4 women, additional body parts. Those first 4 seem to be all related because of that burlap sack. And the investigation doesn't really go anywhere. A lot of people have pointed to the former Suffolk police chief, Jimmy Burke, who was there at the time, and some missteps that happened early on in the investigation that maybe could have solved this case years ago. What happened there? What was going on with the way it was initially investigated?
The former Suffolk County police chief was criticized for his work with Gilgo because of his ties to sex workers. Many people thought that he actually derailed the investigation and stopped the FBI from continuing. And many people think that if he didn't do that, there could have been an arrest much sooner.
Some of the missteps seemed obvious to the critics from the outside who've taken a look back at the case, and it included not working seamlessly with the FBI, maybe even stonewalling federal officials who wanted to get involved in this case, and the use of basic cell phone technology and tracking maybe where some of these calls and some of the cell phones were being used in this area. Those seem like pretty obvious things that could have taken place early on.
That was obvious, but also tips that poured in to detectives. A witness who was friends with one of the victims reached out to police saying that his friend was last seen with who he called a hulking man. Sounded just like Rex Heuermann in a green Chevy Avalanche, and that was the car. He was still spotted it and driving when he was arrested.
And then years later, a strange development, and it has to do with a belt or a belt buckle that the police commissioner at the time decided was important enough to let the public know.
A black leather belt embossed with the letters HM or WH was recovered during the initial stages of
She shared this image of a belt buckle with initials, whether it was RH, WH, MH. Now, presumably the H relating to Heuermann, whether it was him or someone in his family, but it was found around the legs and ankles of one of the victims.
Whatever it was, it didn't lead to much at the time. And then we get a new police commissioner who comes in and a new district attorney. Rodney Harrison was the chief, the commissioner. What led him to want to restart the case? Was it public pressure? Whatever it was, we know that he decided he was going to help the task force. And that's really when this investigation is kickstarted.
When Police Commissioner Harrison came in, the case finally started to build momentum. He came in, he toured the Gilgo Beach site almost immediately. He called the press there and he promised transparency. That was his biggest thing. He was going to be transparent. He also started the Gilgo Beach Task Force.
We had 1 sergeant, 3 detectives, we had 1 person from the state police, we had 1 FBI agent, and the district attorney had a team of people that were coming in and out of the task force, and 1 liaison person investigator from the sheriff's office.
Dan, it was 6 weeks after the establishment of the task force that they had Heuermann as a suspect. We, of course, didn't hear about it until his arrest, but he apparently would get a new burner phone every single time he'd allegedly murder another victim. And as far as the Chevy Avalanche, they had access with the task force to a database with old license plates. It wasn't a new car. This was a very distinct Chevy Avalanche. It was green. How many green cars do you see on the road? And it was also linked to a tip that came in from one of the victim's friends who said she was last seen in that car with a suspect who matched the description of Rex Heuermann.
And so the police get this tip about a Chevy Avalanche, which is a relatively unique vehicle. They match it to this database and they track it back to Rex Heuermann. So they kind of know where he lives in this area of Massapequa Park. The cell phones that potentially were making these calls to these victims end up being burner phones. And the investigators are able to link the origination of those phone calls, not just to Massapequa Park, but also to areas in Midtown Manhattan where, hey, it looks like Rex Heuermann may have an architectural office or an office because he was an architect. What happened with this connection here?
They were able to triangulate where he was making the calls from. And one of the victims' families came forward saying that they were receiving taunting calls. And leading up to the arrest, they, so to speak, pulled the trigger so quickly because they were monitoring Heuermann's search history. They said he scoured the internet at least 200 times for details about the status of the investigation, about the victim's family members. And they worried that he may do something again. And that's why police say they acted so quickly.
And what do we know about him? I mean, he's an architect. He worked in the city, owned his own firm, and by all accounts was a very successful architect, was somebody who apparently was kind of a wizard with some of the building codes and sometimes would be someone who you could go to fix your problem. I mean, he was pretty successful.
So many people would say this was the last person you'd think it would be. He was living among us in plain sight for so long.
So investigators really have started to piece together their case. They have a description of a person who is a large man that matches a physical description for Rex Heuermann. They have the details about this vehicle, which appears to match his vehicle. They have the origination of these cell phone calls from Massapequa Park and Manhattan, all linking back to Rex Heuermann, but they still feel like they need that piece of DNA evidence.
Dan, it was a piece of pizza crust that police were able to match to DNA found on a strand of hair on the victims.
And that's when they move in. And the arrest is dramatic when you see some of the video of it. He's leaving his office in Midtown Manhattan, busy street. And here we have surveillance video that we've since seen of it, where the investigators and the detectives, they walk right up behind him, several of them, and they take him into custody. Can you describe that video, that surveillance video? I know you've seen it.
Then they move right in on him. It was probably the last thing I'm sure he'd expect. He was leaving work for the day. They met him in the city, I'm told, by investigators, so they'd have a long ride to Long Island with him. And getting from the city out to Yaphank on Long Island could take well over an hour, and they were hoping that he would say something. But I'm told by Sheriff Errol Toulon Jr., nothing was said. He asked to be read his rights, and that was the last thing he said.
And Jodi, you've covered this case so closely. I know you've been out to Gilgo Beach. I know you've been to the neighborhood. And I know that you've spoken extensively with some of your sources within the sheriff's department who know what he's been doing in jail. It's been months since he's been in custody. What do we know about what he's actually been doing now that he's in custody?
I call it the evolution of Heuermann. As I said, I've sat down with Suffolk County Sheriff Errol Toulon Jr.
Lately, Mr. Heuermann is participating in our recreation, religious services. He does go to our rehab unit to take out books. I'm not sure what books he's taking out to read. He watches TV from time to time.
He's held separately from other inmates, but he is entitled to review some of the evidence, and he is taking time to do that. He told the judge at this most recent court appearance that he says, yes, I am, when he was asked if he was able to do that. But he's also taking time to meet with the Catholic clergy. He's reading books, and sometimes he's watching the news. But as far as socialization goes, he's in complete isolation from the other inmates, and he is under surveillance.
I want to talk about that court case because it was very interesting, the court appearance. One of the most recent ones is when his wife, who basically is his estranged wife at this point, I know they're going through the divorce process, but she was there, and it was the first time that she was at a court appearance. What do we know about that?
We've been learning a lot more about her, and she's been in public much more than she was in the beginning. In fact, we confirmed that she visited Heuermann in jail. And when she walked in, she went right through security. She went upstairs. At one point, she actually exchanged glances with Heuermann. When he left, he turned around and, this very tall man gave a big dramatic glance over his shoulder, and she slightly smiled. But her attorney says the reason why she showed up was to be able to hear and see the evidence for herself. She didn't want to learn about the case through the media. She wanted to be there.
He's appreciative that she's here, and my understanding is that she doesn't believe that he was capable or committed these acts.
She has also spoken through her attorney in the media, talking about the deep search that took place at the Heuermann residence. Investigators were there for weeks, and you were also there speaking to people in the neighborhood, where all of a sudden you learned that one of the most notorious alleged serial killers of a generation has been living amongst them. Talk to me about your experience in the neighborhood and also what we know about the search of the Heuermann house.
Well, Asa Ellerup, Heuermann's estranged wife, insists if in fact these heinous crimes are true, she says he was living a double life. They descended on his home. They spent weeks there. They were combing through pieces of possible evidence. They dug up his backyard. They were walking out with boxes and boxes of evidence. They had to make sure they looked at every single inch of the home, both inside and outside.
And we don't know, or at least it hasn't been made public, if they believe that he allegedly killed these women at his home, in the truck, at another location.
That's still unclear. What we do know is that the evidence and the investigation was, quote, fruitful. That's what District Attorney Ray Tierney told us. Now, there was testimony from a witness who said one of the victims was last seen inside his home. As you mentioned earlier, and as we discussed, there were hairs found on burlap sacks that had his wife's DNA on them. And one could only imagine whether she had anything to do with it.
Investigation is still ongoing, and a lot of speculation is still ongoing as well. Some of it recently when an attorney for one of the victims, John Ray, one of the victims' families, came forward and held a strange news conference. And he put forward a few theories that maybe there's a lot more to this case that hasn't come out yet.
So despite Suffolk County and despite the police department saying that Shannan Gilbert, who was ultimately the sex worker that sparked this whole investigation, despite them saying that her death was accidental, John Ray, who represents some of the victims' families all along, has been saying this is not an accident. This was never an accident.
I think that Shannan Gilbert was murdered.
He, over the past few weeks, has been coming forward, sharing testimony he's collected from witnesses who say they've had encounters with Shannan Gilbert years ago. A woman, I'll never forget this, a woman who he says was a taxi driver at the time, who was called to a motel where Shannan Gilbert was crying inside. And she claims and described, the physical appearance of Rex Heuermann. And that's a very difficult thing to do for someone who may not have seen him, but she said this was him. Shannan Gilbert was inside. She described her droopy eye, which was a very main characteristic. That was something that she had. And if you didn't know about her and if you hadn't seen her, maybe you wouldn't be able to describe that.
One of the other theories that came forward was that potentially some of the victims were in Heuermann's house and the wife knew about it.
You mean to tell me in the age of the internet and cell phones that she had no knowledge of where he was and what he was doing downstairs?
Another piece of testimony we learned about was a woman who said that one of the victims was last seen inside the house. She and one of the victims went to Heuermann's house. She says Asa Ellerup was inside. She described encounters that they've had. She said that they were swingers, allegedly, and she said that one of the victims was inside the house screaming, seen naked and running, except Heuermann used to say that it was a game that they played, and that was the last time she was seen.
He was a serial user of sex workers. He would sometimes have them come two at a time to his house, and his wife was home upstairs.
Those theories and this press conference maybe seem a little outlandish, but what led credibility to it is that Rodney Harrison, who is now the former Suffolk County Police Commissioner, was there with John Ray. What happened? Why would he stand with Ray? And he's not the police commissioner anymore. What happened with him?
Shortly after that press conference, he announced his resignation. And that was one of the last times he stood beside John Ray in public, kind of putting his name behind the press conference. John Ray is an attorney who, as I said, represents some of the victims' families, but he's not part of the task force. But having, Harrison beside him kind of gave it a little bit more power.
We know that Rodney Harrison is no longer with the department, and that Ray Tierney, who is the Suffolk County DA, certainly is at the forefront of the investigation at this point.
Dan, Ray Tierney is prosecuting the case himself, which is another bold move. So you have Harrison, who stood beside John Ray, but the fact that DA Tierney is prosecuting this case himself, it's not an easy case. You have to prove that Rex Heuermann was the one who killed these women years ago. So that's using DNA, that's pinpointing and piecing together so much evidence, and he's putting his name on the case.
There have been so many twists and turns in this case, and there are more victims in this area. A lot of the focus has been on the Gilgo Four, and then there's also a lot of unanswered questions about what happened with Shannan Gilbert. So there's potentially a lot more to come here.
This is just the beginning. Police have their work cut out for them. They have to look into whether there are other suspects out there. Right now, Heuermann's the only one in custody, but he's been charged. He hasn't been convicted, and so many families of these victims are also hoping and looking for closure.
Jodi, you've been following this case for years. You've been looking into all the different angles. You've been on the ground. You've been talking to investigators, victims' families, people who live in that neighborhood out in Massapequa Park. And I'm sure we'll be talking to you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
The Tape Room, a true crime series created by Fox 5 New York. For more episodes, scroll down here on Fox Local, or find us on YouTube at Fox 5 NY.